Our civilization would be unimaginable without the contribution of the ancient Greeks. One aspect of this not to be underappreciated is their contribution to our approach to sport. There are many ways in which this is so, but in this video, we're going to take a look at the Olympics and a way in which our approach is now deviating from the Greek legacy. Welcome to my channel. If you like content about literature and history, do me a favor, like and subscribe. Now, it seems to be now an Olympic tradition that before each Olympics, we have some controversy and argument over the participation of Russia, everyone's favorite naughty country, whether it's doping or the treatment of LGBT people in their country, as was controversy at the time of the Sochi Winter Olympics. Now, of course, it's the war in Ukraine and Russian foreign policy, perhaps generally. So the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, has previously banned Russian athletes, and they are being called on by some national governments, including my national government, the British government, to continue this ban, while they themselves are saying they would like to find some way for Russian athletes to compete in the Olympics under terms of so-called strict conditions of neutrality. And these athletes would need to demonstrate somehow that they are not supporters of Russia's foreign policy in Ukraine. This is, of course, should be obvious to everyone. That's quite a humiliating demand to make of athletes, not a demand made to the athletes of other countries, at least not at the moment. So in response to this, however, the Ukrainian government has been quite upset. They're saying if the Russians are allowed to participate under any terms, they will boycott the Olympics themselves. So even if it's the terms that I mentioned, where they demonstrate, these individual athletes demonstrate they don't support their government, Ukraine is going to boycott, and my government, the British government, is backing them up. I thought it'd be interesting in this video to consider what would the Greeks think of this? The ancient Greeks, not today's Greeks, ancient Greeks, the people who began this tradition. If you try to explain to them that a particular state taking part in the Olympic festival was going to be excluded because of their foreign policy, what would they make of that? So let's meet our 5th or 6th century Greek. Now, I think the first thing that's going to come to his mind when we explain the situation is he's going to ask us why. Why are some trouser-wearing Scythian savages being invited to the games in the first place? The ancient Greeks didn't invite everyone to the Olympic Games. If you wanted to join, you had to be Greek. That was the criteria for entry. It was not universal. It was not for the whole globe. It was an ethnic and religious festival for the Greeks themselves. Perhaps we can explain to our 6th or 5th century friend here that in 2,500 years later, everyone in the world is basically equivalent to Greek, or we are cosmopolitans, a term he may have heard of, but he might indeed associate with some crazy man who lives in a tub. But let's for the argument of this video, let's assume we can convince him that the people living in Russia are Greek enough to join the Olympic Games. When the time for the Olympic Games was close, a spondai, or a sacred truce, was declared, and eligible athletes started making their way to Olympia in the Peloponnesian state of Elis from all over the Greek world. Elis was responsible for hosting and managing the games. The criteria for entering was ethnic, not political. It depended neither on your country's foreign policy nor its political ideology. Let's say you are an athlete from Boeotia and your state is at war with the Thocians, as they often were because the two states are old rivals. A month before the Olympic Games, the sacred truce comes into force and you will travel south to Olympia. On the road, you will meet athletes from Phocis, your enemies. No doubt you'll want to tell them how much you'll enjoy thrashing them in the games, but you will not engage in any violence against them because to do so will have dire consequences for yourself, personally, and bring shame on your entire country. It doesn't even matter if at that very moment your respective hoplites are slaughtering one another on the battlefield. To reach Olympus, the athletes from Phocis will even need to pass through Boeotia, and they will be allowed through without molestation. To do otherwise would be to bring the wrath of God and all Greece upon you. Similarly, It didn't matter if one state was a democracy, another a tyranny, an oligarchy, what the respective rights of women or the status of slaves or the sexual mores were, and all these things did vary greatly throughout the Greek world. Once in the games, all those differences, at least in principle, were set aside. So what I described there is an ideal, how it was supposed to work in principle. It didn't necessarily always work out perfectly. Two cases in particular come to mind when the Spondai, the Olympic truce, was challenged. The first was in the Persian Wars, when the Persians came over across the Bosphorus and occupied the upper two-thirds of mainland Greece. The resistance coalescing around the Peloponnese and, ultimately pushing the Persians back. But while the war was ongoing in 476 BC, they conducted, as if nothing was going on, Free Greece conducted the Olympic Games at Olympus in Elis as normal. And when they did so, many Italians came, or I should say Greco-Italians, Greeks in far southern Italy and Sicily, came to join the Games, as was their right as ethnic Greeks. But there was some controversy about that. Some people saying they should tell these Greco-Italians to piss off back to Taranto and Syracuse because these states weren't doing enough to contribute to the defense of the mother country in its moments of crisis, and yet they were turning up expecting to take part in Greece's most important athletic, cultural, and religious festival. There was some frustration about that. But the principle of the Spondai, the principle of the Olympics, was maintained, and the fact that they were Greeks trumped their foreign policy, their politics. The second case is when later in 420, in the 420 Olympics, Elis, so as I mentioned, this is the state that organizes the Olympics, they actually prevented the Spartans from taking part, and they were demanding money. They said that they claimed, probably spuriously, that the Spartans had broken the Spondai themselves and thus should pay some money to take part, pay a fine. The Spartans didn't acknowledge that they had broken the truce and so weren't able to take part in the games. Now, this was political maneuvering on Elis's part because Elis had broken away from the Peloponnesian League, that is Sparta's confederation or alliance system, and formed a new one with Argos and Athens, rivals of Sparta. So this was, I think, quite blatantly political exploitation of the Olympics, and that's something I think is very reminiscent of modern times. But this happened one time. This happened this one time in the period that we're talking about, and was probably shocking for the people involved. But it didn't become regular. It didn't become a perpetual habit of the Olympic Games. Partly because Elis spent most of its history in obscurity, and when it was involved in cross-Greek crises, it was with the other Peloponnesians for the most part. So there wasn't such a problem. So let's take a step back and see how we contrast the ancient Olympics with the modern ones looked at in this way. We are both more exclusive and more inclusive than the ancient Greeks. They wanted to exclude people based on their nationality and their culture. You had to be a Greek to take part, but they didn't care about your ideology or usually your politics. You could be a tyrant son from Syracuse, a helot-bashing Spartan, an Athenian democrat, or an Ionian oligarch. Once the games began, they were all Greeks. But we are the opposite. All nations and cultures are included, but then we get very upset and start wanting to exclude people when it turns out they have starkly opposing foreign policy agendas and ideologies. For the Greeks, the Olympics were an expression of cultural and ethnic unity that transcended politics. While for us, they represent a sort of global unity, but devoid of any religious, ethnic, or cultural character that gave the original Olympics its purpose. And this has left a void, I believe, into which only politics seems to be able to enter. So in this important respect, the modern Olympics actually inverts the original purpose of the ancient Olympics, as all the ethnic and religious substance has been removed from it. Maybe the Greeks knew what they were doing. Maybe they understood that they could have a mostly non-political sporting festival precisely because they kept the nationality criteria strict. Maybe it is us, the moderns, who have gotten things completely backwards.